And I should say, as lead of our independent school practice group, as Ashika said, she leads on the West Coast. I'm based on the East Coast. And we have a big and thriving independent school practice group. So we will work with about 130 schools this year, a real variety of sizes and types, and certainly geographically diverse. So we're excited about sharing our knowledge with you today. And as Ashika said, really important topic around endowment. Anecdotally, I will say that our clients are asking us more and more about helping them, to make the case for endowment, and what will resonate with donors, and certainly schools appreciate the importance of endowment fundraising. So we want to get started today just by sharing a little data and looking at the landscape for independent school in terms of endowment fundraising. This data is taken from a recent Case NACE report. You may all know this, but I'm excited about Case and NAS have collaborated on putting together a report, and it just came out recently. And this data represents responses from over 500 schools. So you'll see that the 25 of new funds, and that's the way Case NACE is reporting it now. They're not talking about annual fund or campaign. They're talking about the aggregate of new funds that are being committed, being raised, and 25% of those new funds are being committed to endowment. And again, I would say they don't have historical data. My sense is that that's a marked increase over previous years. And I would say anecdotally from the campaigns that I'm involved in right now, and in a couple slides, it will reflect this, that more money in campaigns is being raised for endowment than for capital. I think one campaign that I'm involved in right now is a $100 million campaign, and it is 100% endowment focused. There's not one capital element in it. So again, I think in a post-COVID environment, COVID certainly shone a bright light on the importance of endowment. Those schools that had an endowment had some flexibility and some durability, and those that didn't, and who were tuition dependent, really had some challenges. So again, we know this is an important topic and an important time for endowment fundraising. So with that, we're going to ask you a quick question. So a quick poll: what percentage of your annual philanthropic revenue is designated for endowment? So I'd love to get a sense of where you are in your endowment fundraising in the past year or so. So if you'll take a second, answer the poll, eager to see the results. And while you answer the question, I neglected to say, we invite you to keep your camera on and add your school to your name so we know who's in the room. And at any point, if you have a question, feel free to come off mute and ask. We'd like to make this as conversational as possible, so don't be shy.
Sorry, Bob, tech support here. I think that we're having some issues with the poll. Folks can try again pressing on selecting a response, but I think we might be having some issues. I don't know.
That's okay.
It's gathering results. I'll give it another second and then we'll share results in a moment.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Margaret.
Hey, sorry about that. I think that the poll question is not gathering, but maybe folks can pop their ideas or responses in the chat as we talk.
Thank you, Meredith. Great. Great. Well, thank you for those who put answers in the chat. So interestingly, and this reflects what I shared before, in terms of boarding school, 40% of gifts are for endowment. And you can see in these first two top lines for boarding and day school, interestingly, that boarding schools are raising more money these days for endowment than they are for capital. And I think, you know, for several reasons, right? I think one, just in terms of operating budget and capital expense, given the fact that you're managing a campus of tremendous facilities and a broad program that goes beyond academic, the importance of endowment is essential. And these schools have more of a tradition of endowment fundraising and were established and built on endowments. But again, if you're a boarding school and you are tuition dependent, you're going to be challenged. So there's a real focus right now in the boarding school world about raising endowment. And again, with legacy gifts and alumni, they have more opportunity to do that. But I thought this slide and this data is really interesting in terms of the environment that we're currently in and the funds that are being raised. So we talk a lot about this, and this won't be news to most of you, I am sure, but you know, in fundraising, we used to talk about the 80-20 rule, right? We used to talk about 80% of the funds came from 20% of the donors, and that has really changed. And we find at CCS that it really is 90-10, and that holds true for the data that CASE and NIS have collected. So you'll see on the left that actually even more than that, that virtually 100% of the revenue is coming from 10% of the donors. And, you know, on the right side, you'll see that 36% of the funds received were gifts of over $1 million. So again, really focusing on that major gift level is important, but I think equally important, and you'll see a breakout in the next slide, 73% of donors gave less than $1,000. So I know this slide's a little hard to read, so we'll share the deck afterwards, but I think there are two stories that are on this slide that are equally important. And while we know that the majority of the gifts or the majority of the money comes from a handful of donors, that it's really important to focus on those major gifts. I think when you look at the left-hand side and you look at 73% of the gifts are less than $1,000. You know, that's where your culture of philanthropy really is created. And what's not reflected on this slide, and we at CCS did a bit of our own research in terms of the path to a major gift, right? So on the right-hand side, the vast majority of gifts at $100,000 or more constitute the largest share of philanthropy. Interestingly, though, in our research, when we look across major donors, those that we define as giving $100,000 or more, right? Over 65% of those folks who made a $100,000 gift, their first gift was less than can we jump back? Their first gift was less than $250. So again, important that we pay attention to that 73% that are making smaller gifts, because in fact, a lot of your future major donors are going to come from that cohort. So again, in our research, about a little over 65% of those folks who ultimately made a gift of $100,000 or more, their first gift was less than $250, and it took them just over 7 years to get to that major gift. So just important to keep in mind as you think about who your donors are and the importance of stewardship as well. Sorry, Margaret, now you can advance the slide. Thank you. Part of what's important in thinking about endowment is, and we've heard a lot about this, is the wealth transfer that's happening and will continue to happen over the next decade. And so as we think about what that means for our schools and for legacy giving and generational giving, really important that we incorporate strategies to garner this wealth transfer. And Ashik is going to talk more specifically about strategies to do that, but the importance of the gift planning culture, the importance of plan giving, the importance of bequests, all of that really needs to play into our strategy around endowment fundraising. And we know historically that some of the largest endowment gifts have come from bequests and planned gifts. So again, given this wealth transfer, it's going to be really important that we develop really compelling strategies around planned giving and building that gift planning culture. This slide just reinforces that. When you look at largest donor by source, right? Individuals have been the largest donor by source, followed by foundations. But then the third largest is realized bequests. And again, I think oftentimes schools, frankly, lack strategy around planned giving and bequests, and oftentimes this is, if you will, found money. These are gifts that have not been, frankly, solicited or cultivated. They've just been pleasant surprises, but you're missing a real opportunity, particularly around endowment, not to engage folks in these planned giving conversations. So again, we just highlight that the third largest donor by source is actually realized bequests. So really important to consider. So when we think about the trends, and I started by saying, in the COVID environment, it's shown a bright light on the need for endowment, right? So we're in a challenging economy. We have rising interest rates, increased costs of goods and services. So if you don't have an endowment and you're tuition dependent, you're being challenged. And I think those families who are paying the tuition, it makes it really challenging for them to increase annual giving. I think as operating budgets grow, I think you get that widening gap. And so it puts real pressure on annual giving and real pressure on tuition. And we only have a few levers to pull in terms of revenue. So of course, endowment becomes really, really essential. And so, the last piece of this, and this is a good transition to Ashika in terms of making the case, is a lot of endowment fundraising really is around creating access, around supporting financial aid, right? So as we think about endowment and what its purpose is and what it can do for a school, it really isn't providing access, ensuring diversity, ensuring that we have resources to attract and retain faculty. I mean, that's an issue right now for our schools. So as we think about making the case, how do we make the case for greater access, supporting diverse student body, and really attracting and retaining top faculty talent? And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Ashika.
Thank you, Bob. I think that's just the perfect way to kind of tee up a conversation around endowment. CCS is a fundraising solutions consulting firm, and we've been doing this work for 75 years. And part of the reason that we remain successful in our fundraising outcomes that we partner with our clients on is because we do stay pretty close to the data and what the data is telling us about how the sector is moving, how it is responding, and how our strategies in turn need to flex to be able to meet the moment. And so that was just the perfect frame to kind of think about where the independent school philanthropic market is right now. What are we all fundraising in the context of the environment that we're fundraising in, as we kind of talk about the importance of this endowment and making that case at the schools that we're working with. And we'll cover a bunch of different topics just before we get started here. I want to overview some of them. We've all heard when it comes to endowment fundraising that there's like a typical profile of someone who supports endowment. And the work of fundraisers is to really think about broadening that definition and inviting as many people as possible to understand what an endowment is, what its purpose is for the long-term sustainability and viability of the school, what it means for succession planning from one head to another, what it means to serve as the steward of a school, as the head of school, inheriting a philanthropic culture from one former head and passing it on to a future head. There's this notion of flexibility and an overall sort of culture of philanthropy that our families and that our students are kind of living in. And so we'd like to start with another poll here just for this section. Hopefully this time it works, Margaret, but we'll give it a try. What percentage of your current operating budget is funded by your school's endowment draw? Just give it a couple more seconds here. we see very clearly that 0 to 10% is kind of the popular answer among our folks on the call today. And in fact, that tracks pretty consistently with what we see with independent schools in general. Most recently, Candid puts out these numbers each year in collaboration with the Common Fund Institute. And we see that number fluctuate somewhere between 5 and 10% for most schools, higher if the school has a larger operating budget, a little bit lower if it's a smaller school. So it gives you a sense of, if you're planning for an endowment campaign, if you're building your endowment and you're trying to think about, well, what number should we be aspiring to? What number should we be getting to? Think about that 0 to 10% draw and how it can be contributed towards your operating budget to offset expenses and maybe redirect some funds towards financial aid, towards scholarship. But it's important, again, to just know where the sector is and what we see from our peers across the landscape, and how we kind of anchor our goals in what we're hearing with trends. Tuition increases are just a reality of the environment that we fundraise in, and they're a reality for being able to operate the school with prudency. But they're often not the best driver for enrollment, right? When we're increasing tuition, it impacts retention, it impacts how people think about the school and the school's overall value proposition. And so endowment, to Bob's earlier point, really does allow you to think about increases in tuition a little bit differently. It provides the flexibility in how you operate the school, to think about different ways to expand your efforts towards mission, to expand the work that your teachers and your faculty are doing, to deliver on that mission along with school staff. And more importantly, the sort of cost of tuition, in my mind, is increasingly becoming a little bit of a barrier to access for private education. It used to be the case that it was not only the ultra wealthy that had access to private schools, but even families that were middle class or upper middle class. And we see just by some of these numbers here and how these numbers change on a year-to-year basis that people are kind of getting priced out of the independent school experience. And so there's a narrative in there, as we think about mounting a case for endowment, about the need to keep tuition accessible just for the sake of the diversity of the student population. And that is ethnic diversity, socioeconomic diversity, but also intellectual diversity as well, which really does provide a great and sound environment for students to ultimately thrive into adulthood. As we look at the next slide, we think about how to message endowment for those families or those donors in your community who are outside the typical profile. One of the key sort of answers that we get when we ask folks in an endowment and capital campaign who are predisposed to give to capital because they want to see their dollars go to work right away, one of the things that they'll say is, well, I don't give to endowment because I want to see my money helping students today. So how can we navigate a conversation with someone like that, or a profile of someone like that, and really think about advocacy for endowment from the best and highest purpose of developing that fund? Are there ways to show immediate impact of the endowment? Ways that we're not only going to be perhaps spending, a lot of times for schools that you all are familiar with, many of your own schools, part of the reason that a healthy endowment exists is because there was discipline around spending. And so there was a generation or 2 or 3 of school leadership that was really mindful of how those dollars were being invested and how they were being applied, which allowed for a corpus to build that would create immediate impact. But there are ways to tell this story of how the school is exercising mindfulness, exercising, again, that word prudency, in storing away these endowment funds, thinking more critically about the dollars that are available to them today, and thinking about sort of the long-term impact of the school. But immediate impact need not be, just how you're sort of spending these dollars right now, but more so, how are you thinking about these dollars in the overall spending picture of the school? How can you tell that story as vividly as possible? There's always a narrative at schools. Oh, so sorry. I just have a couple. I'm just going to run through each of these buttons here, but there's an idea around legacy at play at every school that you're either at or that we're working with. This notion that everything you see around you is the result of generosity from people who came before you, because it has largely always been the case that tuition doesn't cover the entire budget. There has always been philanthropic dollars part of the picture. And so when we think about nurturing an education around legacy, there's an opportunity to talk to incoming families. There is an opportunity to talk to alumni about how endowment helps to underscore legacy. That work does not happen, 50 years from now. That work is a legacy is built in the moment. It's built day by day. And there's a really deep and valuable story to tell there. Thinking about results and thinking about impact is also about financial results. So how is the endowment performing? How is the endowment treated? What are some policies and thoughts around how the endowment will be stewarded so that it can grow to a successful place and allow for a tremendous impact either towards a specific project, towards a specific, that's a capital project, or a specific academic or curriculum endeavor. And then lastly, talent. Oftentimes, we at CCS work with schools that tell us, our families see the need for buildings, our families see the need for financial aid, but our families really need to see the need for attracting and retaining the best faculty so that we can be developing and delivering on cutting edge curriculum that ultimately impacts students. It's almost like those three pieces, spaces, talent, and then accessibility or financial aid are a necessary they're necessary pieces to be able to provide the overall experience that a school seeks to provide related to mission. So thinking about how an endowment can be built for this endeavor and talking about that and socializing it with your families on campus will help to build momentum and build visibility around how these dollars are going to be able to go to work in the relatively near future. But just even putting them together today is a step in the right direction.
Yeah. Hey, Ashika, may I just jump in, because all of that is wonderful. I would just add, because I think in recent years, there's been a lot of talk about endowment. And I think an oversimplification that what an endowment really is just a big savings account, right? And somehow, the bigger savings account you have, the better your school. And I think all that you're sharing is so important in terms of, an endowment is meant to be used strategically, right? An endowment is only as good as the way that you put those resources to work to support students and faculty. So while, fiscal discipline is important and saving is important and all of that is true, I think what you're saying around making sure that you educate folks in terms of how the endowment is used and where those dollars go is so important, because what that does, frankly, is it fights the cynicism of people feeling like, oh, you're just trying to have the biggest savings account, and somehow that becomes a bragging right, as opposed to funds that really do go to support on a daily basis the student experience. That also gives your school what I like to think of is durability, flexibility, and ultimately sustainability. So again, we'll talk more specifically, but anything that you can do to educate your constituents around how the endowment is used is so incredibly important. So thank you for that, Ashika.
Absolutely. Let's dive deeper, Bob. I'm excited to talk a little bit more specifically about some of the things that you mentioned. So if we want to go 2 slides ahead to the creating, so we can just go one more over. How do we do that, Bob, right? How do we sort of position the school to think about ways to attract families into just wanting to know about endowment, wanting to know about the strategy that surrounds it, the school's thoughtfulness around it. And it begins with creating recognition and really stewardship opportunities. There's several key components to this. It starts with communication and educating folks around what it means to support the endowment in the short term and what the returns are in the long term. There's an opportunity at play whenever there's endowment dollars coming together for this to be a peer-to-peer experience. So is there a way for us to get our faculty or our staff for those schools who already have a portion of your endowment going towards professional development or going towards recruitment or retention? Is there a way to have your faculty help tell this story? Or if their endowment dollars are flowing towards scholarship, is there a way for students to talk about just the accessibility to the school and what that did for them? I think of a school that a progressive school that we worked with here in Southern California on an endowment campaign as their founder was retiring. And as part of the public phase, it was really wonderful to be able to share a meaningful 2.5-minute video from 3 students who had graduated 20 years before that benefited from scholarship dollars. The endowment was being created to support scholarship, to essentially provide an exclusive scholarship fund. And tell the story of how that education at the school, receiving that scholarship, set the trajectory of their lives from a professional standpoint, but also from a human standpoint. And it really was able to create this sort of human element to the public phase of our campaign to close out with great success. When you think about establishing any kind of named funds, thinking in this vein of recognition and stewardship, it's so important to think through some of those policies and those minimums in advance. Many of the schools that are on the line today, you have endowments that are established, you're looking to grow them. And as you're doing that, those policies and those minimums and those practices, they have to grow alongside that endowment. A naming opportunity, in perpetuity for a fund established within the endowment is something that's feasible, it's something that's possible, and it's something that will allow that person to stay connected with the performance of their fund, how their fund will actually be useful to future generations of the school. But while you're establishing these recognition and stewardship opportunities, keep in mind that inflation is that awful thing that lurks above our heads, and we have to think about how our policies take into consideration, that increasing consumer price index of the future. Will the draw be enough to do the things that the school wants to do? So I give you the advice around recognition and stewardship opportunities with the big underline of Bob's earlier word, that flexibility for the school is the goal here. Financial flexibility to meet the moment, as COVID was such a great experience of what that could possibly look like. And so maintaining that as the end goal in creating some of your recognition and stewardship opportunities, thinking about those two things together is a way to think about donor engagement, a meaningful gift from a donor, but also protecting sort of the long-term interest of the school related to that endowment building. With regard to the stewardship and recognition opportunities on the next slide, we also think about just providing some kind of financial 101 education. We're currently working with a school and in Los Angeles at the moment that has a pretty large endowment for an elementary school. And as we're mounting a campaign, we're getting a lot of questions from the community. It's a capital campaign about why we can't just use the endowment funds to pay for that campaign. The funds have been invested for over 40 or 50 years. As I mentioned earlier, when we look back to the performance of the endowment, we see 2 or 3 generations of leadership that had very thoughtful processes around that endowment management that allowed it to grow and allowed it to really prosper. And so when families ask us about why we can't just, for lack of a better term, tap the endowment to draw from it, to drain it, to fund a campus master plan, there's a story there. There's a reason that previous generations didn't think about that. And so one of the things that we did was put together what we called a financial storytelling video. And it's from the voices of these volunteer leaders who are no longer leading at the school. They've sort of joined a emeritus group of leadership to tell the story of what they were thinking at that time as these dollars were coming together, as these funds were being invested, once again, humanizing the financial picture of the school, reminding families, right, that the school was founded on this idea that a group of families could come together with a dream of education for their children, for children in their communities, and making that dream possible by taking one step at a time. Bringing people into this education around the finances of the school can feel vulnerable. There's always a little bit of caution around being transparent with the full finances of any nonprofit operation. But how we do that, how we tell that story, and who tells that story really makes a big difference. And I think that's particularly true when we think about endowments specifically. Regular reporting is also really important. I'm always so impressed by annual fund reports that have a page on the endowment, even if the endowment is relatively small, and not only has, the pie chart that we're all used to looking at of how much funds are in the endowment, how, what the return on investment is, not only has a financial table of how the endowment performed, but what are some of the practical applications of that endowed fund? And if it is not being used, or if the draw is minimal, what is some of the reasoning behind that? That annual fund can be an opportunity for us to, again, provide that education and kind of tell that story around the school's finances. And lastly, I think about this culture of gift planning. Oh, sorry, you can go to the next slide, Margaret. This culture of gift planning, which is something at CCS that we have been exploring quite deeply over the last 5 to 7 years, specifically as a practice area. Planned gifts are, as we all know on this call, they are the result of a certain type of donor relationship, a certain type of relationship that has been built with an organization. And in the school environment, you're very fortunate that all of your donors are part and they sort of come up through the community. They're stewarded and guided through an education of that experience of being in the community. Your perfect planned donors pass through the hallways of your school in the form of parents, in the form of alumni. And the best way to kind of keep them in touch with the impact of the school is to provide a long-standing education around what it means to set a legacy, what it means to make a planned gift, and how that ultimately impacts the school in the longer term. We encourage you to review your donor lists for families or for alumni that are in their 50s, 60s, or 70s, and to start thinking about, not necessarily sending them, a whirlwind of direct mail pieces to try to steward them from the mailbox, but more importantly, to get in touch with them and do a pulse check on their understanding of the school's history, the school's endowment, the school's growth over time, and trying to meet them where they are in that education, to start talking to them a little bit about what a planned gift could do for the future of the school. When it comes to planned giving, there isn't sort of a tool like wealth screening, that we use for major gifts, or analytics that we use for major gifts. There isn't sort of that exact tool that will give us a sense of, who are those people that are going to be most interested in planned giving. There's certainly analytics that show us if someone's been giving for a long time, so they're a stalwart donor, they're a steadfast donor. But figuring out whether or not they have the appetite for this type of funding it happens through a conversation. And oftentimes we find in schools that are approaching 100 years or just over 100 years old or even older, they've used bequest societies in a really creative way to provide that education and to provide a forum to discuss the role of endowment, the role of planned gifts as they're designated to the endowment, and even share some examples of what that looks like when they come to fruition. Building a legacy and that language around building a legacy, particularly at a school, is so essential for long-term, not just survival, but to be able to thrive in the long term. Because unlike other sectors, as I mentioned earlier, most of your donors are coming from your community. It's very rare that you're going to pull in, even annual fund donors from outside your current population or your alumni population or grandparents. It's very unlikely you're just going to pull someone in who isn't connected to the school as a sort of client, if you will. And so thinking about how to best nurture this education from within, to best build a culture from within, is just really important to building that endowment and making it stronger in the long term. So we wanted to open the floor, just with the time that we have left, for any reactions to this information, any questions. Oftentimes endowment fundraising, it's so unique based on the landscape of the school and based on so many of the details of the school. But I'm curious to hear from anyone who wants to share a little bit about the environment that you might be raising funds for your endowment in, or just some of the culture around endowment at the schools that you work at.
Yeah, and just would encourage everybody to put their camera on and feel free to ask questions. We'd love to hear from you. And while we wait, I actually have a question for the group. I'd love to hear about any strategies that you have for raising endowment dollars with parents, right? As we think about day schools, and I'm generalizing, day schools increasingly have been really reliant on parents versus alums in their fundraising. So would be curious to know the case that you're making with current families for endowment gifts.
I'll acknowledge that that's a struggle. So I'm Marshall Carter, pre